Good afternoon, everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. According to the computer here, it's 1:30. Up first is Renee Fortner, RiverLink's fantastic watershed projects manager.
A little bit about RiverLink. We're an environmental nonprofit based in Asheville, North Carolina, and our mission is to promote the environmental and economic vitality of the French Broad River Watershed. This is the French Broad River Watershed in North Carolina. It's an 8-county region, and our home base is in Asheville. Most of our work happens in Buncombe County, but technically the French Broad River Watershed is our geographical area of focus. Today, I'm going to talk about the Central Asheville Watershed, which is an area that lies at the heart of Asheville. So the area that is yellow on this map represents City of Asheville jurisdiction. And in the very center, you'll see the red area, almost shaped like a heart. That is the Central Asheville Watershed. After a year-long watershed study, we completed the restoration plan in August 2020. And one of the reasons, or there are multiple reasons why RiverLink and our partners decided to focus on this particular watershed in Asheville. There are 3 tributary streams of the French Broad River that flow through this watershed. And they had known water quality issues, including fecal coliform bacteria and other sort of legacy pollutants left over from the industry that used to be built up along the French Broad River. It's an urban watershed, so they receive most of the runoff from downtown Asheville, so they're heavily impacted by stormwater runoff. And these streams, they flow into a section of the French Broad River that is very popular for recreation. I don't know if you've been to Asheville during the summer months and been down to the River Arts District or driven across the French Broad River on one of the bridges there in Asheville, but it's like an interstate of inner tubes. That photo in the upper right, that's like a typical summer day on the river. And so you have these heavily degraded streams entering a section of river that people love to play in. And this watershed also includes several marginalized communities. And these streams flow through their backyards and past their community centers. That stream on the left is known as Town Branch, referred to by locals as Nasty Branch. And it flows through the historic African-American Southside community in Asheville. And it's one of the most polluted streams in Buncombe County. The orange boom that extends across the stream there is soaking up an ongoing petroleum plume that is seeping into the stream from Norfolk Southern Railway property just above that site right there. So a lot of water quality issues, marginalized communities that deserve better. So we set out to develop this plan to address some of these issues that are plaguing this area in Nashville. Looking at the demographics of this watershed, because in order for a watershed restoration plan to be successful, you have to understand the human factors within the watershed. We looked at census block data for Asheville and this watershed in particular. And these graphs show some of the factors that we looked at, including diversity, poverty, and unemployment rates. And the blue bars represent the census block percentage of diversity, the level of percentage of people who are living below the poverty line, and the percentage of households experiencing unemployment. And the blue bars represent those census blocks in the Central Asheville watershed. And as you can see, this watershed has some of the highest diversity, or people of color in Asheville was the metric that it looked at, but also some of the highest poverty and unemployment rates in all of Asheville. So we took that into consideration when developing our project goals. So in addition to, the typical goal, which is to create a 9-element watershed restoration plan, we also wanted to really consider the impact of the restoration plan on these underserved communities. And in order to do that, we set out to gather as much community input as we could. Also wanted to help connect communities to the watershed and develop an appreciation of the water resources that most people, not just these communities, but most communities are disconnected from the streams and the environment around them. And also explore some green job training opportunities. Due to the high levels of unemployment in this watershed, we thought this could be a great opportunity to explore these opportunities to help with implementation of the plan, and then to build a coalition to help us implement the plan. So for community input, we did a variety of things. We created a community survey to gather residents' concerns and to learn more about runoff and flooding issues that may be occurring in their neighborhoods. We wanted to reduce the barrier to participation in these surveys, particularly for the marginalized communities. So we created an online survey. We had printed versions that we distributed to the community centers and local businesses. And then we really had the greatest success going door to door in the public housing communities and asking people, questions, particularly when it came to time to design some of the projects, getting people's input that way. And we piggybacked on other people's events that were already happening in the community. So going to where the people already are and really just listening to residents more than anything else, hearing their concerns. And we learned a lot through this community engagement process. We also set out to build a coalition to implement the plan once it was in place, but this started early on in the watershed assessment phase of the project. We engaged community members by offering service learning opportunities in the watershed. In total, we accumulated within the year of the planning process, we accumulated 300 hours of volunteer service. So volunteers helped us do things like pick up litter and remove non-native invasive plants from the riparian buffer along the streams in the watershed. We engaged college groups, people who wanted to get their coworkers together and go out and do service for a day, youth in the neighborhood, community members. And then we built a core group of stakeholders, people that lived in the community, people that were community leaders. We made connections when we attended these community events, and people would introduce us to others. And we built this core stakeholder group that met regularly throughout the planning process and continues to meet with us to help give feedback and input on some of the designs that we're developing for projects that came out of the watershed plan. And then to connect communities to the watershed, service learning opportunities are great for this, but RiverLink also has a program called Name That Creek, where we work with local communities to give names to streams that don't have a name. And the idea behind this program is that by giving the stream a name that that really resonates with the community, then you can help foster that connection to the stream, and hopefully that will lead to better stewardship of our waterways. And so one of the streams in the Central Asheville watershed prior to this plan did not have a name. And we worked with the local community and they voted to name it Haith Branch. And the name honors a prominent African-American community member, Mr. Lacey T. Haith. He lived in the watershed. His home was actually at the headwaters of the stream that is now Haith Branch. But he was a civil rights activist and a beloved public educator who worked at the segregated Stevens Lee High School in Asheville. So it's very fitting that the stream now bears his name, and is a wonderful way to connect people to their local streams. So after a year-long watershed assessment and community engagement process, we developed the Central Asheville Watershed Restoration Plan. This effort was led by BlueEarth Planning and Engineering. And we identified, typical sources of impairment in an urban watershed, really nothing surprising there. But out of the plan came 75 projects and initiatives proposed to address these impairments. And we estimate between $5 and $10 million is needed to be invested over the next decade to slow down the degradation of the streams and make some, improvements to water quality and the ecology of this watershed. To date, we've secured around $750,000 to implement projects. And if you'd like to explore this watershed plan in greater detail, it lives as an interactive web app on RiverLink's website. So now I'm going to talk about some of the projects that came out of the plan that are being implemented. And I'm not going to go into great detail about each project, but I encourage you to stick around because my colleagues who are working on implementing these projects are also presenting during this session and the next session, and they'll go into greater detail about each of the projects that I'm going to discuss. So first up is the Southside Community Stormwater Project. So as I may have mentioned earlier, the Southside community, it's in the Central Asheville watershed. It's a historic African-American community that was heavily impacted by the urban renewal program in the 1970s. A lot of Black homeowners and business people lost their homes and businesses under the guise of improving our urban areas. Many of them were moved into public housing and still live there today. But the goals of this project were to improve water quality and habitat in a stream that the community refers to as Nasty Branch, but also address community needs, to the extent possible. They're having some runoff issues at a public housing community there in the Southside neighborhood. So this project, one of the goals was to address those runoff issues and then continue building those community partnerships. We were told by residents during our community engagement process for the watershed plan, if you want our input, you need to communicate with us often, communicate clearly, and whatever you do, don't overpromise, because, people in this community, rightly so, are skeptical of outsiders coming in and saying they're going to make improvements to their community, and it hasn't always gone well for them. So we really tried to keep this advice at the back of our mind. And, as we're engaging residents in the design process, which we wanted to do, this is kind of how we're thinking about it. So specifically what the project is going to do, it's at Erskine Apartments, which is a housing authority of Asheville community. And it's going to restore an existing wetland, daylight a stream, and then we're going to replace a concrete swale with a regenerative stormwater conveyance feature. And this entire area drains into the Nasty Branch stream. And we're working with Wildlands Engineering on the final design for this project. In addition to the water quality improvements that we were focused on, we also wanted to help address community needs if at all possible. So we looked for areas where our project might overlap things that, amenities that the community wants and needs, if at all possible. And so through our stakeholder engagement events, we heard from residents that there's a need for safe walking paths to better connect the apartment buildings to one another. Currently, they're dirt paths, and a walking path that could directly connect them to their community center, which is across the street from the apartment complex. Remove a chain link fence that currently bisects the apartment complex and prevents people from, moving in a more direct way to one another's apartment buildings. There's nowhere to hang out under the shade, so we're going to construct a shade structure, a safe bike path for kids, a memorial to lost loved ones, edible plants. Oh, and so we've gotten a foundation grant through the Dogwood Health Trust Fund that's going to help fund the community amenities aspect of the project. The next project I would like to talk about is our innovative stormwater project called DIS in the Mountains. As some of you probably know, DIS is disconnected impervious surface. It's a cost-effective technique to managing stormwater runoff. Basically, you disconnect an impervious surface. Maybe it's your roof, and currently your gutter is outletting onto your driveway, and that flows into the street, and that enters a storm drain. And so you want to disconnect that impervious surface from the storm drain, the municipal stormwater system, and redirect that runoff onto a vegetated area like your lawn or a rain garden. In Western North Carolina, we have steep slopes, and currently the design standards for DIS practices state that they should not be implemented on slopes greater than 8%. And so that really limits our ability in Western North Carolina to utilize this cost-effective way of dealing with runoff. And so this project, the goal is to develop designs for DIS on steep slopes. So we were looking for slopes greater than 8%, and then research the effectiveness of these designs once the features are constructed. So looking at things like how often do they overflow? What are the infiltration rates like? And then obviously looking for any issues like erosion, because these are being built on steeper slopes. And then a really cool aspect of the project is there's a social research component. We're partnering with faculty and student from Lenoir Rhyne University, the Graduate Studies program in Asheville, to look at public perceptions of stormwater management. And they're going to present on that after my talk. So I encourage you to stick around if you want to learn more about that. So what have we done so far? We worked with 6 homeowners in the Central Asheville watershed to construct DIS practices on their property. These properties, the slopes range between 17 and 33%. And they're designed for the 1.5-inch storm. And we're very early in the monitoring process. Early results show good infiltration, and we're looking forward to, so this photo was taken in October when they were installed. They're dormant native grasses and wildflowers planted in there. You wouldn't know it by looking at it, but this spring, we're really excited to see those plants flush out, and the monitoring will continue. So stay tuned for more information on this. And with that, I would like to thank all of our partners and funders. I forgot to mention that the Southside Community Stormwater Project is primarily funded by Division of Water Resources, the Water Resources Development Grant, as well as the North Carolina Attorney General Environmental Enhancement Grant. And if there's time, could take some questions.
We do have a couple of minutes.
Couple minutes, okay.
Please step up to the microphone.
You can pass this along to the next speaker if it's relevant, but that last project you showed with the
DIS
disconnection project, is
Disconnect, yeah.
that is something that's now owned by the city, since it's a I'm just curious, like who cares for that and owns it now?
Yeah, we have maintenance agreements with the landowners
Okay.
to maintain that. And we have offered to help them somewhat with our, volunteers. But yeah, it's up to the homeowners to manage
Okay.
those. So
And that was like an individual homeowner. So those are individual.
those are
homes.
individual
Okay.
homeowners.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mhm.
So next up, we have Keith McDade and Allison Royer, both from Lenoir Ryan's sustainability program, who are going to follow up on the social research components of this.
Thank you so much for help. Yeah, no problem. There's a. Okay, I think we're going to speak individually. Thank you, Renee. Welcome, everyone. Excited to see all of you. My name is Keith McDade, and I'm a professor of sustainability studies at Lenoir University, and that's in Asheville. And I'm here with Allison Royer, who is a graduate student in our program and also a graduate fellow in what is the Rhyne Institute for Conservation of Natural Resources. And we are going to be talking about community perceptions of implementing stormwater management practices on private property in the Central Asheville watershed, as Renee set up for us. So the DIS piece. And we worked in partnership with BlueEarth Planning Engineering and Design, as well as RiverLink and Wildlands. And also want to thank the Land and Water Fund for helping to finance this. But what we're going to be talking about today is I'm going to touch a little bit about the approach we used, and we've been informed by community-based social marketing as an approach to engage a community. We're going to, as a part of that process, build on the existing literature, and that's of course a part of any scientific study, but really critical in that process. Renee did a great job of talking about the context of the Central Asheville watershed, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the context for our research, which is has some specifics. We'll talk about our process, how we engage community, and our interviews and our survey, and we'll share the results of those engagements and how we interpret that and what that means, and relate that back to the community-based social marketing approach, and talk about the next steps. So that's our roadmap. I'm just going to introduce you to community-based social marketing if you haven't heard of it. How many people have heard of community-based social marketing? Okay, some of you a little bit. Well, it was developed a couple decades ago by a guy named Doug Mackenzie Moore, and it's aiming to engage behaviors that we can identify perceived barriers and benefits about, and then address those barriers and benefits. So lower the barriers and increase the benefits to make people more likely to engage in the behaviors. And when we choose behaviors, we choose behaviors that have a high impact. And in our case, we're looking at DIS and DIS related behaviors that have a low penetration in the community, meaning they're not happening a whole lot, they're not widespread, and that have a high probability of moving forward, which means people want them in one way or another. And so we've moved through the first 3 stages here, where we're now in the process of developing strategies, and we are also simultaneously piloting strategies, not only the test sites that Renee talked about, but also social strategies for how we engage people to learn about what's going to work and what's not going to work before we go much larger. And then ultimately, the goal is to go larger. And we build on the existing literature in a number of ways. This here is a reference to a study by Smith et al. From 2019 about using community-based social marketing for stormwater management practices in Waterloo, Ontario. And I'm not going to say much about it other than what you see here is the 2 most cited barriers are cost and lack of knowledge. And you'll see when we come around to sharing our results, these align with ours. We, of course, referenced and looked at lots of literature as we were going along. And one particular study I want to mention, and I want to name someone who's not at this conference, but you might know, Kristen Cockerell from Appalachian State University does a whole lot of work on stormwater perception. And she did a presentation at the Western Piedmont Council of Governments Water Quality Conference along with the Reese Institute last November. And I'm just going to share a little bit about some of her findings to connect them with what we're doing. And so when she asked the question, what does the public think about stormwater? Well, first of all, this isn't a widely studied area. Second of all, it's complex. And third of all, context matters critically. And they looked at a very wide ranging area of Appalachian Mountain communities from New York down to Georgia with 1,400 respondents, which we didn't have that big a sample. So it's good to look back and forth at what they did find. And the context of the Central Asheville watershed becomes really critical for what we were looking at. And first of all, you all know COVID-19 still among us, but has created a challenge for going door to door as we wanted to do in some ways, and it changed the rules of engagement in a lot of ways. Also, right in the middle of data collection, Tropical Storm Fred hit, and that actually kind of gave us a little bump in people being interested in stormwater issues because they were hearing a lot more about it in the media. And the other thing I want to mention about the context is there's a climate justice and climate equity initiative that the city of Asheville has been engaging, and that's been happening in parallel to what we're doing. And we could simultaneously learn from what they're doing and not duplicate what they're doing. But they were having a lot of community meetings around what is happening in your community and what can we do about that. Our process involved connecting this to multiple classes that I teach. One of them is called Environmental Policy. Another one is Visions of Sustainable Communities. And another one that is happening this semester is Sustainability, Behavior, Education, and Communication. And in that, students have been involved in almost all aspects. But more importantly, Reese Fellows, such as Allison, who has done the most of the work here, have been involved in making what we've done what it is right now. We conducted 15 interviews last spring with community leaders that are engaged in the community, and they not only told us about what they cared about, but also about how to engage the community more effectively. So it's kind of a strategizing set of interviews. We also conducted a survey which aimed to tap knowledge, awareness, context, the perceived barriers and benefits that I mentioned, interests people have, and potential action steps. And I'm going to turn things over to Allison Royer, who's going to tell you all about that. So thank you. I'll be back.
Thanks, Keith. So since the survey was completed in class, we used various distribution methods to try to reach as many people as possible. This included 2,000 postcard mailers, which you can see here on the screen, also reaching out to local neighborhood associations as well as other community partners. And I also spent 2 days tabling along the Greenway on the French Broad River. We faced several challenges while conducting this survey, which included reaching a diverse group and also getting people interested enough to take the time to complete the survey. So to combat these challenges, we tried to reach out to groups with different backgrounds and offered the survey in Spanish. And as well, we offered an incentive of raffling off a free rain barrel for anyone who completed the survey. We finished with 87 completed surveys in total to analyze. So these are the demographics of our sample. The sample was relatively evenly distributed across age, household income, and relation to the watershed. Although not everyone who answered the survey was a property owner, the majority were. And 92% of our sample was considered above the North Carolina poverty line based on their annual household income level. And the majority of our respondents were white, and neither of these are consistent with the demographics of the entire watershed. When asked how high of a priority are stormwater issues to you in the Central Asheville watershed, the majority of our respondents responded with a priority of 3 or higher. This could show that our sample has a bias for caring about these stormwater issues. This bias about caring towards these issues could show that we are engaging these innovators and early adopters according to this diffusion of innovation model developed by Everett Rogers. When asked to what extent are you familiar with the following terms, our sample was relatively familiar with the terms stormwater, stormwater management, and green infrastructure. However, there was a clear difference, and most of our respondents were not at all familiar with the term disconnected impervious surface. This finding was not at all surprising to us, as the term disconnected impervious surface is not widely known, even to many of you in the audience. So this may suggest that we more effectively communicate about DIS using a more familiar language. Most of our sample was relatively knowledgeable regarding the factors that can negatively impact stormwater quality. However, there was a clear difference for pet waste and yard debris, and we thought this was interesting and think it could be based on the perception that these factors are natural, so they are less impactful than the other factors, or that community members may perceive their own behaviors as less impactful than those that they can't control. When asked to what extent do you experience flooding in your immediate neighborhood, the majority of our respondents marked that they experience flooding to a small extent of 1 or 2. This could mean that that flooding happens more downstream from these respondents, and could show that our sample's perception is influenced by a lack of flooding in their immediate surroundings. Similarly, the majority of our respondents responded that they have 50% or more of their property uncovered by hard and penetrable surfaces, meaning that there's lots of opportunity for water to soak through the ground on their properties, and also lots of opportunity for DIS to be installed. When given the chance to respond to a question regarding flooding problems, neighbors were mentioned several times, whether it was water flowing to or from your neighbor's yard, or your yard being fine, meanwhile your neighbor's property floods. We also found it interesting that several people mentioned puddles that slowly soak through the ground as a problem, when this could actually be seen as a positive thing when done intentionally through DIS. So clearly our sample has some knowledge of the problems and the causes of stormwater management, but there may be a knowledge gap in the solutions to these problems, such as how to slow it down, soak it up, and keep it clean properly. Keith is now going to explore some of the more specific barriers and benefits from the survey.
Thanks, Allison. So one of the things that we looked at was, what do people have on their property? What would they like on their property? And what have they never heard of? And not surprisingly, consistent with what Allison said, not many people heard of disconnected impervious surface, you see on the bottom there. But many of these other efforts are very much aligned with and part of disconnected impervious surface interventions. And as I mentioned before, when we're looking for behaviors that we might engage, we look for low penetration and high probability. And if you see rain gardens towards the top there, the number of people who don't know what rain gardens are is the same number of people that actually don't have rain gardens. And it turns out that there's a whole lot of interest in rain gardens. And so that would be one particular behavior area. There are many others here where terraces, rain barrels are interests, and yet there's not a whole lot of penetration, even among what we think are the early adopters in this group. So what do you think the perceived barriers are? I already mentioned a few. Similar to the Waterloo, Ontario study, we found that cost and lack of knowledge were the most rated barriers to engaging in these behaviors. And that's really critical because, as Allison mentioned, there's knowledge about the problem, but not knowledge about what to do about the problem. People also did mention labor and time as important factors. And they also really pointed out that it's not the lack of interest that is keeping them from doing this. If you see the far end of that. We also asked if there are other barriers that people perceive that we didn't list from all of our preparation in developing our survey. And there are two things that I want to point out here. There was a pattern of people who were worried about making things worse. I don't want to do something that's going to mess it up. And there was also a pattern of responses about working with neighbors in a cooperative way, that they needed assistance because these issues transcend boundary lines. And so those were important to recognize and consider. We also asked an open-ended question about what kind of assistance would be helpful. And it turns out technical assistance is the most important, followed by design, installation, financial, and then maintenance at the lowest end. But technical assistance aligning again once with this lack of knowledge that we're focusing in on a little bit. We also looked at what motivates people to want to do these things. And not surprising with our bias sample that people said improve water quality, environmental responsibility, and improve biodiversity, and even connection to nature were motivators for this particular subset of the population. And it was, aesthetics and financial reasons and stress relief, more personal reasons were ranked a little bit lower, or at least by fewer participants. And that's also interesting to consider. So we've got a lack of technical knowledge or a lack of confidence in the knowledge of what to do, but yet a really strong interest in DIS practices, even without knowing what DIS is. And these perceived barriers of cost and technical knowledge, and also not knowing what to do, combined with, for early adopters at least, recognizing that people want to take the responsible action and protect their water quality. We also asked about perceived responsibility. Who is responsible for managing stormwater practices on private property? That was the question we asked. And what's interesting here is city government and county government got a slightly higher number of respondents that said that's who is responsible. But it turns out that most folks said, well, it's us, myself. If you look at the third from the left there, myself, my neighbors, businesses, we're all almost equally responsible for this. The funny thing about this is nonprofits got the lowest ranking here, and yet they're doing the most. And so that's something to consider. And adding on to this, when I'm going to connect back to Kristen Cockrell's work, she looked at a similar question and found that residents thought that residents and businesses were responsible, but also found an additional factor was that they weren't equally responsible for paying for it. They were only responsible for doing it. And so there's this mismatch between who's responsible for paying and who's responsible for doing. And so that's a conundrum, but something that we didn't research, something that we essentially explored and are considering. And in general, there's a perceived responsibility, there's perceived cooperation, and I'm going to turn things back over to Allison.
So since there's this rather equal sense of responsibility across the various parties, this could mean that there's a perceived sense of shared responsibility when it comes to stormwater management. This perceived sense of shared responsibility plus the responses regarding neighbor relations could suggest that there's a perceived need of cooperation among groups in order to properly manage these problems. According to our sample, there's not a lack of interest, but rather a lack of knowledge about solutions and how to properly work together across property lines. And so even though it is clear that more knowledge is needed among the community regarding DIS, it is well established among conservation research that knowledge alone will not lead to action. So we will need to do more than just share information. We are currently using awareness of diffusion of innovation processes by having those 6 test sites that Renee mentioned. And we held a workshop at one of these test sites to show the community what is happening here. And also these workshops open the door for a community influencer to emerge. And they also increase the observability of these DIS projects by diffusing the idea throughout these neighborhoods and showing the relative advantage of these installations. There's also the potential to create new social norms, which could even lead to a new paradigm of human stormwater ecosystems as the ultimate goal. However, we understand we are currently engaging the innovators and early adopters, so our strategies will change as we move throughout this process and engage different groups in order to properly address them based on their norms of what they're doing compared to that of the entire community. So currently in our class this semester that Keith mentioned, behavior, education, and communication of sustainability, there are several student projects focused on community outreach and engagement. One is focused on enhancing informational signs that could be placed at these test sites in order to address the perceived lack of knowledge and engage the community in order to access this information in a different way. We're also looking to make online information more easily accessible, and there's a discussion of a potential community meeting. We will be interviewing the immediate test sites in order to understand how their perceptions may have changed over time as an observer of this process. There will even be a larger survey in the fall, and we will also begin to explore possible ways to engage stakeholders for policy implications. So in summary, Context is very crucial in addressing these perceived barriers and benefits to a desired behavior. There are early adopters who want to be engaged, but they may need your help overcoming barriers such as knowledge and cost. And we are aiming to create the conditions that can influence people to take action on their own properties. And we will also continue to explore these marginalized communities, understanding the importance of their insights. Thank you.
I guess so.
So we're getting set up for the next speaker who will be virtual. Are there any question that can be handled in about a minute? Please step up to the mic if you do.
I have funding to do CBSM on this topic and we need to collaborate on this. So it's more of a comment. And I should have realized that already had I looked at your outline as one of your session people. I know Marshall's going to get me, but I'm excited about that. So I didn't know you were doing CBSM. Awesome.
Next speaker is Tim Ormond with BlueEarth Planning and Engineering, and he is going to talk about the research, the DIS research and demonstration projects in Asheville.
Okay, can people hear me?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, terrific. Well, thank you. Glad to be here with you all in the form of a hologram. I've never done this before. And would like to talk about the innovative stormwater green infrastructure project that Renee referred to called DIS in the Mountains. A quick plug for our company, BlueEarth. We're based in downtown Asheville. We do water resources planning and engineering. We're a mission-driven company. And I think we're the first certified B Corporation in North Carolina that's an engineering firm. There's only a handful around the country. So you've heard what DIS is, but I'm still going to mention it, then talk about stormwater challenges in the mountains, our research project, the planning, design, construction, monitoring, next steps, and then have some Q&A. Just setting my timer. So what is DIS? You probably already know that, but it's one more acronym that you can add to your collection. It stands for Disconnected Impervious Surface. And the problem is connected impervious surface. So this shows an example of a downspout that's piped to a driveway that goes to a street and a storm sewer system, and then goes into a creek. And though it may seem like a minor issue, if you take 1,000 square foot roof, 1 inch of rain, you end up with 600 gallons. If you had 50 inches of rain a year, you're dealing with 30,000. Community with 10,000 roofs, 300 million gallons, etc., like the old shampoo commercials. And then when you think about the water quality impacts, they can be very significant when you accumulate that. So DIS has been mentioned before. This is the long definition, but it's essentially just taking runoff from impervious areas and redirecting it to vegetated pervious areas for infiltration. And fortunately, it's already in the state stormwater manual. It's a low-cost, simple practice. It can be done at the residential scale, DIY, and it has potential widespread application. And that's really why we're interested in this, is we think it's something that can, when you accumulate the effect, can really have a great positive impact. Renee showed this diagram already, but essentially you're disconnecting your downspout and redirecting it to a vegetated area. But there are site constraints. Slopes are limited to 8%. Unless you have highly pervious soils, then you can increase it. You need sufficient vegetated area for infiltration. And of course, there are limited options in the mountain region. So stormwater constraints in the mountains or challenges. Some of them are pretty obvious, is that most of our slopes are greater than 8%. It's hard sometimes to find slopes 8% or less. In fact, we have some sites that are 50% or more. There's insufficient vegetated area for infiltration, cost concerns, maintenance concerns, impacts on yard usability. And it's really not a high priority unless you have some kind of existing problem like a slope failure or flooding. And so a brief history of steep slope stormwater techniques. You may have seen some of these ancient terrace systems. This is one in the Philippines that apparently they were trying to meet their NPDES permit about 2,000 years ago and grow some rice in the process. This one is in Peru and in China. And these go back hundreds of years. They weren't specifically designed for water management, but they did involve water retention on slopes. We did a literature review looking at different stormwater manuals, over 20 different manuals, and you won't find many stormwater practices for steep slopes unless they involve some special technique such as a retaining wall system. And that piqued my interest about 10 years ago, and I embarked on this research project in Mars Hill, which is about 20 minutes north of Asheville, the Steep Slope Bioretention Pilot Project, and designed two different basically terrace bioretention systems using segmental block wall and gabions. And we worked with Mars Hill University to do monitoring. It was a successful research project, but as you can imagine, the cost is fairly high once you're dealing with structures like retaining walls. Also looked at some simpler, more cost-effective approaches and developed this infiltration garden. It's using sort of permaculture techniques, constructing swales on contour and using the material that's excavated to build berms, basically to intercept the flow coming down a slope. And this particular one was on a slope of about 20%. So I've kind of had this in my back pocket for a number of years. We planted it with elderberries and other native and edible vegetation. And that brings us to the DIS in the Mountains pilot project. So the project goal is just condensing the words here, was to manage and treat stormwater runoff and then develop DIS techniques for mountain regions. And then, of course, the social research that Keith and Allison just talked about. And I guess you know a lot of this already. It's in the Central Asheville watershed. Our fearless leader has been Renee, RiverLink. Grateful to NC Land and Water Fund and the rest of our team, including Wildlands. We started with the site selection process, and it started with a remote GIS desktop analysis. And we looked at steep slopes and other parameters and narrowed it down to a measly 337 properties, sent out a mailer, got a pretty good response, I think greater than 10%. And then Renee and I did some drive-bys and site visits. We ended up with a lot more interest than we had budget to fund, but we had this criteria matrix, including slopes, high visibility, constructability, and some other factors, and then ranked the top 10 sites. Picked the top 6, and all of them were willing to participate and signed 10-year agreements. This shows a distribution of the sites. They're spread out around the watershed, and part of that was just to have visibility to different neighborhoods. And Renee already mentioned that the slopes in these sites just happen to be from 17% to 33%. I'm going to show you some photos of the different sites. And so this is an older neighborhood. And so you have, homes that were built in the 1920s, some are newer, but basically small lots. And sometimes, runoff goes from one lot to the next. Here's one site, slope of 33%. This particular site had 3 potential locations. We picked 2 of them. One of them had utility constraints, so we opted not to deal with that. This site had some steeper slopes, but the average slope was about 19%. And this one was on a corner lot with a slope of about 28%. This was our gentlest slope at 17%. We had this one that had some existing terraces. We had a design that was going to work with the terraces, and then because of some budget constraints, we opted just to work with the upslope area, which was also at 17%. So we went through a brainstorming phase, and our drivers were really to come up with reproducible, simple designs. We didn't want to get too complicated. We wanted things that could be effective, but reproducible and even do it yourself. But we borrowed from some maybe permaculture thinking in terms of earthworks, which basically means just working with the existing earth and doing grading and shaping and using the material on site. And from there, we ended up with two basic concept designs: the swale design that I already talked about. And when you get above a slope of greater than about 4:1, you're going to start to need to move into some kind of structural intervention, like a retaining structure or boulders. This is just an example of swales on an agricultural field. This is a cross section basically just showing that water is intercepted by the swales. And you can, in these cases, you can plant either in the swales or the berms or both. It's an example of a basin system. I've heard this one referred to as a boomerang basin, where flow goes from one to the next. This is an example on a larger scale in Australia. So that brings us to design. And some of our key design principles we focused on: currently connected downspouts. This is the biggest one that I wanted to bring your attention to, is volume-based versus area-based, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. As Renee mentioned, our goal was the 1.5 inch storm, because that represents greater than 90% of all storms. And a key constraint is available space. We started with a maximum storage depth of 12 inches, but we ended up lower than that. And all of our overflows were through 4-inch diameter PVC risers with atrium grates. And we did that because we didn't want to, I guess, have the risk of spillways, earthen spillways and berms eroding. And then this is key as well, is using existing soil, no engineered media. We didn't bring in any underdrain systems. And then working with native inedible landscaping that was appealing to property owners. So if you're going to remember one thing from this presentation, I'd say this would be it. On the left is from the state stormwater manual. That's an area-based design. And on the right is our design. So basically we don't have the flat areas for infiltration. So we needed to build in storage volumes within our design on the slope itself. This here is just a spreadsheet of sort of the balancing act we had to play. We had the roof areas, the available space, and the volumes that we were trying to achieve. And this was one of the tools. From there, we ended up with our concept designs. This is the swale concept design. Basically, all the downspouts are piped underground into these swales. And then there's an overflow through the 4-inch riser. And this is the basin. Essentially, same concept, but just different shape based on sort of the landscape. These are some of the details showing cross sections and profiles. And in terms of roof area, we ended up capturing between 480 square feet to 1,320. And these are just schematics of each of the different sites. That brings us to construction. We constructed a total of 8 rain basins and 4 swales on 6 sites. And the soil was mechanically fluffed, is what the contractor called it, for to a depth of 12 to 18 inches. And what that showed really is that we could get a lot of infiltration on the site just by working with the existing soil. Total roof area disconnected over 4,700 square feet. We compacted earthen berms, and a lot of that was done by hand. And all the downspouts were piped underground. We had a total of 900 plug plants and 14 native plant varieties, a lot of pollinator species. We also did some ever-bearing strawberries. We're going to be planting some blueberries on the periphery shortly. That was all done by volunteers. Total construction budget for all the sites was about 22,000. That includes the monitoring equipment and as well as the plantings. Just want to show you some pictures of construction. This one, 40 Congress, is a 2-swale system. And the property owner is kind of a local community activist and very engaged in the project and built this really nice stone wall to contain the practice. This one has 2 separate basins. You can see very high clay soil with the red color. This one is a corner lot. We were calling this one a wraparound swale. Renee gets credit for that. She's trademarking it and came out really good. This had a very large front yard. So we did a 3-basin system. We were actually able to divert the entire roof, 1,320 square feet. And this one was 2 interconnected basins. And the one with the terraces, we ended up going with a single basin just upslope of where those terraces are. To quantify the volumes, we use this 3D scanner application for iPhone 12, which I don't have. But one of the property owners alerted us to this, and it's a very handy tool in case you ever want to do some surface characterization, and you can just bring it into a program like SketchUp. We did these planting plans aiming for a lot of different color and biodiversity and 3 or 4 season interest. And RiverLink did these great signs, which are installed, and they have QR codes that will link to the project site. So anyone walking by can just link to that and learn more. Okay, we're now in the monitoring phase. We have a 2-year monitoring period. We're engaging residents to monitor rain and also smartphone app. The inflow is simply the contributing roof area and the rainfall data. And the outflow, we're using these low-cost vortex meters. They're about $100 each. And the jury is still out in terms of how well they work. We're concerned they might not be capturing the low flows. We'll be doing infiltration testing of soils and also monitoring slope stability, erosion, vegetation, maintenance, and evaluating the impact of the range of slopes on DIS practices. The results so far, lots of community interest. We had more people interested than we could implement practices for. Property owners are happy so far. Initially, they basically had pits with mulch, and the plantings were done in the fall, so everything was dormant. But as Renee said, we're looking forward to everything coming to life soon. The berms are holding up well. Infiltration has been very high from what we've observed, and the vortex meters we'll see. The next steps is completing the monitoring, completing the social research, and spreading the DIS information, disinformation. So don't report me to the authorities, but if you do, I'll just tell them about this project. We're grateful to WRRI for the conference and these other forums. We're going to be presenting at the IECA conference. That's erosion control. Technical report, you can go to RiverLink's website. Many things I've loved about living in Asheville. I'm holding down the fort here for everybody else. It's got a great community spirit. And I just saw this 2 days ago that apparently we have roving gangs that are marking their territory with positive affirmations. And I was thinking that for DIS, we might start our own gang and spread the word through graffiti. Renee also had the idea of having matching DIS face tattoos, but we're still thinking about that. So that's it for now. Thank you for being DIS interested. I don't know how much time we have, but I'd be happy to take a question or two.
Thank you, Tim. If someone wants to step up to the mic, that would be fine. I do have an online question, and it relates, I think, to the need for education and technical assistance in this area. The question is, how does a property owner determine if they have a slope of 8% or less for a standard BIS practice, or, you know, or whatever their slope may be for one of these practices?
You know, one simple way is using like a piece of wood, some kind of flat surface, and on an iPhone or other smartphones, there are different inclinometers or tiltometers to do a measurement. If they reached out to RiverLink, we could probably help them with that.
Yeah, I'll say on RiverLink's website, we have something called the WaterRich Guide. It's a guide for residential stormwater management, and there's a chapter on measuring slope. Pretty straightforward instructions.
This is a question for Renee. With the Southside project, how did y'all identify who the community leaders were, or did you just ask the residents who the community leaders were? And another question is, did y'all have any existing contacts with the Southside community before this project, or not?
No, not before the watershed planning process. No, prior to the watershed planning process, we did not have existing connections in the community. But I will say that the Housing Authority of Asheville, you know, provided a lot of information on community leaders. There's a separate nonprofit called the Residents Council of Asheville Housing Authority, and it's made up of people who live in the public housing communities. So we reached out to them, and they were an amazing resource. And then people came up to us at the tabling events and would introduce themselves, and often they were community leaders, and yeah, kind of went from there. Yeah.
So folks, we've got to let you get to your break, but the follow-up session for this, we're going to have more presentations and then kind of a panel discussion. So if you have additional questions, you know, try to attend the next session. If you can't and you want to drop off a question, write down a question to me and give me an email address. We'll try to get you an answer. Thank you all. Thanks, Tim.
Tim, did Tim just go away? Shoot.
Yeah, I'm gonna go to Barber's and then. Yes, okay.
So you mentioned